I was having so much fun talking about that digital stuff, which obviously is a whole nother class, that I totally forgot to finish up on that communication. So sorry about that. So this is the other half of module two. Better late than never, I guess. So in this, there's several, there's a lot of this stuff, a lot of anthropology and a lot of anthropological theory and explanation seems pretty straightforward too. You realize if you look at it in a structured way and use it to compare and interpret societies, then all of a sudden it's a lot more complicated than it just sort of sounds when you just sort of give out like a definition. So let's be aware of that. Two books I would really highly recommend if you find any of this area of communication language interesting. They're both quite old. I'm sure Hall's passed away quite a while ago. But he was really sort of in anthropology, if you're looking at cultures, if you're looking at societies and groups, really critical theoretical approaches and sort of ways of looking at all this. Once they've been defined, really it isn't necessary to come up with like a new and improved version all the time. As we'll see when we get into things like religion, we still use Durkheim's original sort of definition of what religion or belief consists of. And now it's generated in the 1880s, but it's a fantastically short, very concise definition. People have written whole books on it since then, but to be honest, their definitions are a lot more screwed up and a lot more specific and generally don't work as well. So sometimes just because someone was sort of like first to bat doesn't mean it was like the first is not as good as fifth or seventh. Sometimes first is the best. I would put Hall in that one of those categories. Edward Hall starts as a kid growing up in the Southwest, or I think he actually grew up in the Midwest, ends up in the Southwest on one of those 1930s work projects generated by the government, Civilian Conservation Corps, I think it was. And finds himself working with two Indian populations in the Southwest, the Navajo, or markedly the Diné, and the Hopi. And in the process of having to work with them, remember he's a construction foreman or something, so he's actually working with them. He's not studying them per se. And he's still only, I think, like 18, maybe even 17 at the time. So he finds himself working with these folks, has no knowledge of who they are, totally has no background with them. But in the process of working with them, he gets to be friends with them, understands them, and his fascination with how they saw the world and how it was different than what he grew up with. In other words, finding his ethnocentrism and the sort of awareness of it actually to be really intriguing, drives him in or shifts him into anthropology. So he comes out of a situation where his cross-cultural experiences lead him to a field where he can examine that. And he becomes the critical player in the 20th century, looking at issues of nonverbal communication, of the use of space as a form of communication, and all these other ways that at the time people weren't looking at, because at the time this branch of anthropology was linguistic anthropology. So they were the folks that generate, they were related to the folks that generate syntax, grammars, and teach a foreign language. They were looking at it from the standpoint of social use. In other words, why would you use a particular phrase in French, for example, in a particular social situation? But it was still always the spoken language. And that's all they really paid any attention to. He completely sort of flipped this on its head, because in his interaction, especially with the Diné, who I've interacted with a little bit, Diné don't tend to talk a lot. They could go for literally an hour or two and not say a word when you're working with them. But their spatial communication, in other words, their nonverbal communication is very complicated. It's totally different than the American system, but it's very complex, and that's actually how they do a lot of their communication, is not by what they say, but how they move, where they stand, and how they stand, stuff like that. That's what he was picking up when he was originally working with them in the 30s. Out of that came one of his seminal works, and I think he has about 3. That's this one here. The Silent Language, written in, it's really old, 1956, or something like that. So it's, by now it's what, 7 years old, but it's beautifully written. Almost all of the studies and all the analysis that he does in terms of the importance of nonverbal communication is still in common use today, in the sense that if someone's involved in nonverbal communications in marketing or some other area of broadcast, for example, or now YouTube, their training is all based on Hall's work. So his work has never been superseded. It's just become so common that I don't think people realize it. So that's the one recommendation. The other recommendation, especially if you're actually sort of vaguely interested in anthropology and how someone becomes an anthropologist, and also some fantastic stories, because he was a great storyteller. It's his autobiographical thing where he actually talks about his experiences in in the Southwest, and how that got him interested in anthropology. It's called West of the 30s. Absolutely fantastic book. Real easy read, real interesting to read. It's one of those books, if you're done reading, if anyone's interested in Native Americans and or the Southwest, you just give it to them as a gift after you're done with it. But I can't recommend that book too highly because it's very rare that you actually found autobiographies that are actually readable and not sort of hyping themselves by anthropologists and or in any discipline, that just sort of show you the process by which they discovered their area of interest. So very good book. So I recommend any of his works, any of Edward Hall's works, but that's West of the 30s, which was printed a little later, I think. 1994. Yeah, I think it was his last work actually. Is absolutely fantastic. So with that, let's segue into this last area, because it would be actually not a bad idea to read Hall's West of the 30s first and then go through this. I don't have it as a textbook because, you know, people are sort of allergic to textbooks, or textbooks have to do the way you think textbooks should operate. Henry's is a textbook. It gives you, you know, the very concise information areas we're going through, and it's pretty well written. It's got some interesting stuff, but it's a textbook. Hall's works tend to be very popular. In fact, Silent Language is one of the best sellers when it came out in the 50s or 60s. In fact, all of his works were bestsellers, not just in anthropology, but just in people reading nonfiction. They were top sellers in the day. Still heavily consumed, by the way. Okay, so communication language. Communication has only two forms. And these seem pretty obvious, but they're really not. This is what we call open or closed. Now, closed communication systems are what insects tend to do. If you're an ant, you communicate through pheromones. If you're a bee, you communicate through pheromones and movement. Those are closed systems. If you're an ant talking to another ant in your hive, you're born with that communication strategy embedded in you. So it's sociobiological. The smells that you see that other ant generating, the touch that it generates, and what it sends as signals, immediately makes sense to you because you're hardwired for it. So closed communication systems have one enormous advantage, and that's, you know, especially true in things like insects, social insects. And a good example would be an ant. If an ant feels threatened and it runs back to the hive, the pheromones it sprays out says danger, threat. The movements the ant's doing, which are very stiff and rigid, generates danger, threat. And every ant that smells or sees or touches those movements and smells immediately knows exactly what it means. So the great advantage of closed communication systems is its total clarity in terms of what you're trying to say. Every member of that group will understand exactly what it is you're trying to get across, because there's no confusion, because everyone is hardwired for exactly the same thing. If you do this, it means exactly that. And everyone knows when you do this, it means exactly that. So it's a perfect relationship. Now, that's fine as long as what you're dealing with are very simplistic, you know, straightforward things. Where's food? Is something trying to stomp on us? You know, whatever that might be. However, you know, like outside of my house, we got a bunch of miners running around out there. Miners, on one hand, are partially closed communication in the sense that there's some things that miners do. When a miner screeches, that warns all the other miners there's danger around. And that particular sound is unique to that species. I suspect it's probably unique from group to group or island to island. I'm not too sure. I suspect miners in India make slightly different sounds than the ones here. But it's still hardwired into their system. In other words, they're born with that, understanding what that means. Having said that, if you've ever watched miners, and they are fun to watch sometimes, you realize that some of what they do is actually learned. If you pay attention to a group of miners and you see the young ones, you can see they mimic and copy their elders. They're actually learning how to make noises and communicate by watching things. Now, you don't have to do that if you're hardwired. An ant doesn't have to go to ant school to figure out how to be an ant. An ant is wired with that sucker. Any ant that's born that functions immediately understands all the communication strategies within the group. So they're a true closed system. One of the realizations, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, has been that a number of different animals actually don't have closed communication systems, or in part it's closed, but other parts are what we call open. So miners, for example, can not only pick up new sounds, they're great mimics, but if you watch and you see a miner pick up a new sound, you'll realize very quickly that it actually can teach other miners that sound, and for somehow they figure out what the meaning is or what meaning they want to put to that sound. So in that situation, they're not hardwired, they're actually inventing something. And what you can find, and you probably could see this if you studied mine as I haven't, would be that you would find that a new minor coming into the group would have to learn this new set of sounds and the meanings attached to them because it wasn't hardwired into the system. This is the difference between a closed system and an open system. A closed system has the tremendous advantage of total clarity. The disadvantage is you can't discuss anything that you might have in your head, anything that you've seen that doesn't fit within the box of those things. Now, for some aspects of human behavior, we use closed systems. If you're flying an airplane and you're talking to a tower and you're going to land an airplane, with say the FAA, that's got a closed system. There's a very rigid set of words that you can use, and everyone knows what those meanings are. Because the last thing you do is have some discussion of some guy's bringing in a 787, and no one's really too sure what the hell he's up to. So you can't have confusion. You have to have that clarity. If you're in the military, artillery observers have the same thing. If you're an artillery observer and you're going to, call down artillery shells on a position, everyone better make really sure that you know exactly what you're saying and the guy at the other end knows what you're doing. So there's no like oops moment, all of a sudden bang, stuff ends up in the wrong place. Now what that means is what you have in human languages, and this is true of all human languages. All human languages are not closed. All human languages are open. You can have little artificial subsets, military, pilots, that have artificially closed systems that you have to learn. And for example, if you're going to become a pilot, you have to take tests to make sure that you know exactly what that closed system of pilot speak is, and you never deviate from it. All human languages are open. Now, the huge advantage of an open system is you can have Lewis Carroll writing Alice in Wonderland. You can have an entirely imaginary world, or Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. You can have an entirely imaginary world in your head, put it down or tell it to people, and they can actually experience a version of that because you've actually described something that's never existed and will never exist. But that doesn't mean you can't communicate it. On the other hand, and this class is a good example, I think probably any class you take at university is a good example. The huge confusion of an open system is I can be totally clear in what I think I'm saying, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to pick up the meaning that I intended. So open communication systems has huge flexibility, but they don't have clarity. Closed systems have no flexibility and they got tons of clarity. So one of the huge shocks in the last 20 or 30 years, especially in the last 20 years, has been the number of animal species that actually have very diverse open communication systems. Crows and blackbirds, I think, are terrifying. If you ever go on YouTube and look at short videos of foxes, foxes have this very surrealistic and apparently very, very learned form of communication strategies. Unlike dogs, where a lot of it seems to be, dog communication seems to be pretty much closed. Fox communication, from what little we're starting to study it, seems to be largely open. So theoretically, you took a fox and put it in another part of Europe or something like that, it couldn't talk with it. It would have to learn a whole new language. So open and closed are hugely important. The other part of this is that all open languages, because they are symbolic in the sense that you make a noise, but the meaning attached to it doesn't have any relationship to the noise, means that all languages are in some ways equally complex. So for example, if you look at English, which has a gazillion words and tries to sort of pretend that most of those meanings are pretty fixed, those you're well aware that ain't true, looks like a lot more complicated language than, say, Hawaiian, which has a much smaller vocabulary in terms of the number of words, till you realize that most words in Hawaiian have 3, 5, 7, or 10 meanings, which are working there all the time. So if you're speaking Hawaiian, the different meanings of each word are tied together and they're not defined. They're complex. So if you're speaking Hawaiian, you have to think very carefully about the way the words relate, because all the different ways each word can be interpreted are in play. In English, we specify by virtue of how we phrase the word, the phrase itself, the context, which of those meanings we're using. So Hawaiian might not have as many words, but in some ways it's more complicated in other areas. A perfect example, having someone who had to learn some Mandarin, or Putonghua, is more accurately called, is Chinese, i.e. Mandarin Chinese or Han Chinese, is actually quite a bit easier than English in some regards. There's no tenses, for example, in verbs, and context is a lot easier. It's a lot more straightforward. Having said that, in Mandarin, they use 5 pitches. So the way if you go up at the end of a word, or if you go down at the end of a word, or all those things that in English are used out of curiosity or interest, you know, what? You know, or something like that. In Mandarin, that changes the word. Whereas in English, it's just putting an inflection on it. In some ways, Mandarin is a lot easier than English if you're going to learn it. In other ways, you know, if you're an English speaker, Mandarin's a nightmare. Now, my wife, being from Hong Kong, speaks naturally Cantonese, and that's even worse because that's got, you know, I can never figure out it's got 9 or 13. That's got even more tones to it. So on one hand, again, the large parts of the syntax are really simple. Other parts are a nightmare to someone who's not used to the idea of tones changing words. So that's open communication systems. In some way, shape, or form, any language you try to learn is going to be as complicated as any other language. Some might seem a little easier. For example, if you're an English speaker and you learn Spanish or French, well, those languages have enough common root, you know, background that's similar that you can sort of muddle your way through parts of it. So it's probably a lower learning curve. But all languages are just as much of a nightmare if you actually have to learn them. And so that's one of the key things to remember when you're talking about communication. Open communication is tremendously flexible. Our world wouldn't exist without open communications, but it has its own complications, which you can see anytime you look at people dissing someone on what they said on a YouTube or especially Snapchat or Twitter, something like that. When I didn't, you know, you guys misunderstood what I said. Okay, that's open systems. Languages have two other aspects that are really key. One is languages are always by a group. When my nephews were little, especially one of them when he was a little monster, well, actually sort of a good kid, he developed his own language. You know, for a while it wasn't a language. He developed his own thing. He would sit up there, and by the time he was like a year and a half, he'd come up in your face and he'd just give you crap. He would just lecture you in words and gibberish. You know, at least that's what it sounded like. Now, the reason it wasn't a language is that he wasn't communicating. You know, you could tell he was pissed off or wanted something, but you didn't know what the hell it was because you couldn't figure out what it was he said. He in his mind had somehow related a set of noises to a set of meanings or things he wanted. But that never got anywhere. And of course, then he got more pissed off because he'd sit there and he'd be trying to tell you something and you'd be like, dude, I don't understand. And then, you know, I'd start to just light up. So the languages are collective. No person is a language. Languages have to have at least two people. You have to have someone making the noise or reading or writing or whatever, and someone understanding it. So languages are always shared. Okay. Second part of languages is they're always arbitrary. And again, the classic example would be Mandarin and English. My language tends to go up and down a lot. I use a lot of tones. I'm not sure where I picked it up, probably from speaking Spanish when I was a kid. But also Arapaho does that a lot. So I'm used to a lot of tonal variation, which makes it very hard for me to speak Mandarin because I tend to use tones a lot to make inflections, whereas in Mandarin, I can't do that. It's like walking in a minefield because I can literally, by virtue of changing a tone, I can change I want to buy something to I want to sell something. It's actually the same word. It's just where you put the pitch up and down, changes from buy to sell. As you can imagine, that can cause a lot of excitement really fast. So all languages are equally arbitrary. There's no relationship between the noises that are made and the meaning that you want to have a context to it. So all languages are entirely symbolic. Now, if you remember when we were talking about that earlier, that's why languages are such an absolute furball when it comes to figuring out what the hell they're up to. Sociolinguistics. This is the idea, and this is what, well, you know, Hall's work is a good example of this. This is largely what anthropologists that were into linguistics were looking at even from the get-go. They were not interested in generating dictionaries and syntaxes and grammars about, you know, how to speak Mongolian, since we were watching that video. That's not what anthropologists did. What anthropologists would be interested in is, for example, thinking that Mongolian video would be, why are those guys using particular phrases when they're doing that ceremony? When I can almost guarantee Mongolian, there would be other words you could do which might sort of do the same thing. So the context in which you use words and phrases is what we call sociolinguistics, the social aspects of linguistics. So that one again breaks down pretty clearly. Sapir-Whorf, that came up a little bit in one of the videos, I think. I think that guy that did that whole series in Answer did. If I can find, if he did one, I'll post that up for you guys to watch. Sapir-Whorf were two folks that were looking at this whole relationship of perception and communication. And again, because you learn a language, and you have to learn it not only in terms of how the words sound, but also what the words mean, they became really fascinated with the idea that to a certain extent, the words that you learn and the meanings attached to them shape the way that you see the world around you. In the sense that if you look at someone who's an adult, if there's something they don't have a word for in their language, and it's around them, it probably means they don't notice it. They don't see it as something of notice. So one of the famous ones is there's several populations, I believe, in Central Africa, Rwanda somewhere, that don't have a word for the color orange. And if you show people a color chart like a rainbow chart, they'll see they'll see red and they'll see what we would call orange. Some of those will be actually red, and some of the other oranges that are lighter will be seen as yellow. Now, it's not that they don't see that color, in the sense they don't see that thing that's not red and not yellow, but they don't see that as a separate one. They see that as a version of red. In the same way you think in English, you have like the idea of dark red, bright red, and all sorts of it. Bright yellow, deep yellow. So again, even in English, there's no point at which something's one and not another. So they were arguing that to a certain extent, these folks didn't see orange, which I would disagree with. I just say that they don't see it as a relevant category. The classic one here in Hawaii would be that Hawaiians had a number of words for what we would call the ocean. So if you're standing at the beach, staying at Diamond Head looking out over the ocean there, Hawaiians would have 3 or 4 words that would describe what you see as you're going out. English just has pretty much ocean or maybe sea. And none of them really describe conditions because, to be honest, American English is a land-based terrestrial language. It has very little interest in water and the ocean. It has very few words for it. Hawaiian and other Polynesian languages, especially Micronesian languages, have a lot of words for water because you lived in a world that largely consisted of water. So you better have a lot of words for it because you want to make sure that when you're talking about it, everyone you're talking to understands exactly what you're meaning. You don't want one of those oops moments. So Sapir Whorf is relevant in that part of what they're arguing seems legit and certainly makes sense when you think about it. To a certain extent, the world that you see is a reflection of the words and the concepts that you know. But this got pushed by the 50s and 60s into the idea that if you didn't have a word for it, it didn't exist, which is a real stretch. I think more importantly, I think you could argue political correctness, especially starting in the 1990s, where if you don't allow people to use a word, somehow means that then you're going to get rid of the attitude and perception behind it, which turns out to be, of course, you look at the current discussions going on in 2020 as a total is another fallacy. That just doesn't happen. Not using a word doesn't mean the concept behind it disappears. It just means that people come up with another way of saying the same thing. So political correctness in terms of speech correctness is a zoo, and there's no the evidence in anthropology would be that's a road not worth going down because you're not going to get the results you want. Hall's work, especially that one I showed you, silent language, is talking about 2 aspects, which is the last 2 on this slide. That's proxemics and connexics. And again, he didn't invent the terms. Well, I think he actually did come up with the term proxemics. Kinesics was around before. But he's the one that first realized that they were actually hugely important when it comes to communication. Again, given his background with Native Americans, and if you deal with a lot of Native American groups, and Arapaho Cheyenne aren't quite as bad, but Arapaho Cheyenne like to be about 2 meters apart. So if I'm talking to one of my relatives on the res, you're going to be standing about 6 feet apart. Now, American society, i.e. Anglo-American society, is about 1.3 meters. So if you get someone who's classically American and they go on the reservation, we'll say some government agency or FBI or some other group out there, and they're going to talk to someone, they're going to be trying to reach their comfort zone, which is about this far apart, we'll say. Now, if I'm the Native American they're talking to, I want to be out here. Now, of course, you ever see this, and a classic example to see this is when COVID, quiets down and you see meetings at the East-West Center. This is probably the classic place to see this because you got folks from a ton of different cultures. And it's amazing how people have spent their entire career in foreign service or something like that, have so little awareness of proxemics. They actually use it, but they don't realize they use it, and they don't realize the variation. So if you got the situation, the Indians over here and the FBI guys over here, and he's trying to interview this guy, then he's going to just automatically, without thinking about it, try to get back in his comfort zone where he can talk comfortably, and that's going to be here. Now, the more he does that, the more the Native American's going to resent this because someone's intruding on his personal space, his personal bubble, and he's going to move back to his comfort zone. I can see where this is going. It's disappearing off the camera here. So he's going to move in pretty soon. Native Americans are out in the hell. Now, one of the side effects that Hall brought up that was very important is not only is this distance variable from group to group. In other words, different cultures have very different proxemic distances, for example, for person-to-person communication. But when push comes to shove, If this guy is talking to this person and he's saying something, and he's saying, I want to be friends, and yeah, let's have a relaxed situation, and he keeps on moving in on this guy, this person will not listen to the words that are coming out of his mouth. What he'll see is the physical movement that's taking place. And one of the classic ones, if you want to really irritate and piss off your friends, is when they're telling you something that they consider is really important, like something that happened to them, someone dissed in their parade today. And the first thing you do is you go like this. Even online, it works equally well with the camera. What you're basically telling them is that I don't care. I'm not listening to you. It's slightly more subtle than doing this. But it communicates, at least in the United States, it communicates the same thing. In Anglo-American society, crossing your arms means I'm not paying attention to you. Now, if you just happen to cross your arms because you're just making a movement, you might still be paying attention. But the interesting thing is you'll find almost invariably they will pick up on that movement. And if they say, well, aren't you listening to me anymore? And you really go, yeah, I'm listening. They're going to look at you. Well, it doesn't look like it. It's frequently what you'll hear. And they're right. Your body language, the space in which you communicate in and the way that you move, tons of studies are showing that's considered more relevant and more real than the words that you speak to come out of your mouth. Now, this has become a huge issue for politicians because if you're trying to do something, you're trying to get someone to do something, you find that they're very careful about how they use proxemics and kinesics, and whether you love or hate Trump, he's very, very good at this. The guy is absolutely great at the way he moves and presents himself and sets himself up, both in the way he uses space, oftentimes to intimidate others by moving in on them, but also in the way he does his body language. So he's very good at almost like silent film type stuff where you could communicate without having to speak. And that's what Hall's specialty is. Hall's specialty is nonverbal forms of communication. So proxemics is the use of space in communications. Think of the FBI, the Phoebe, and the Native American. Kinesics is the use of body movement in communication. So think of going like this. Two huge parts because both of them are more powerful than the spoken word. And it wasn't until Hall's work in the 50s and 60s that people really realized this. Now, much of the work in proxemics especially is actually not available because you find that it's been done commercially for companies, especially in companies involved in advertising, video production, something like that, consultants, for example, in communication marketing that are dealing with politicians. If you want to be a politician in the 21st century, you get training from people whose specialty is proxemics so that you don't get caught in a situation where you're threatening people, or even more so kinesics, where someone asks you a question that, well, did you beat your dog up when you were a kid? And you go, no, I never did, which sort of implies that maybe you did just because you're crossing your arms. So the Hall sort of put a light on this, and it's a huge part of what anthropologists looking at communications do today. And it's a huge part of folks involved in communications outside of anthropology. But again, it comes from his work because he's the guy that sort of defined it, pinned it down, and wrote about it to great length. Okay, last of these we've actually we've sort of seen this in part, and again, the Mongolian one's a really good sort of case that we kind of don't really understand. To be honest, I don't understand. I think that's called Nadam, that ceremony that they're videoing, and which is a hugely important thing in Mongolian society, and I think in the summer it's a ceremony they do. But I'm not really sure what it's about or anything. I just sort of remember seeing something to video on it. So anyways, so when you look at rituals, you'll frequently see in American English, the entire language of communication, people have their own morning rituals. No, that's not a ritual. Rituals are socially defined. So when you're actually using the word rituals, anthropologists use it, you're talking about something that a group has basically said, this is the way you do stuff. Let me write this down. I got to send you guys a video on Japanese meeting rituals. That's really quite good. So, in fact, this is one of the classic examples. If you're going to do work in Asia, for example, if I'm working in China, if I'm back with my Chinese colleagues, or I'm working with guys I work with in Japan, and you're meeting someone for the first time, Japanese meeting rituals are entirely different than American counterparts. I mean, obviously you're meeting someone you don't know, so that's the same. But Japanese meeting rituals are some of the most formal. Chinese are actually almost as formal, but it looks a little more, I don't know if I'd call it subtle, but it's not quite as structured. So it varies a lot more from group to group. Chinese greeting rituals or meeting rituals are in part defined by what level you are socioeconomically. Japanese really aren't. It's what it is. So if you're meeting someone in Japan for the first time, and you'll see this in the video I'll send you guys, you can't actually acknowledge the person exists till you figure out what they are in terms of social rank vis-a-vis you. So this is one of the reasons that Japanese use business cards, even if they're not business people. But they have some sort of position. The card that you give out will be your card. So for example, the cards I've got actually say what I am on one side. So you give the card with both hands like this, and the other person gives you their card with both hands. Now you've bowed casually to each other and you're watching each other. So you now look down at the card and very quickly read it in terms of what it has on it. And what it will tell you is who that person works for and what's their position in that particular organization. At that point, then you're going to see the two people will bow again. Now they know who's supposed to bow. Again, lower ranks bow more than higher ranks. So now they know how that's going to work. Now they can talk to each other, because in Japanese language, your social position defines what you and how you say things. Japanese is a hierarchical language. This is one reason why Japanese folks that learn Japanese, for example, here on the mainland or someplace else, when they go to Japan, Japanese are always rolling their eyes. They call that horizontal Japanese because it doesn't have that rank built into it. In Japanese that you see people speaking in Japan, it invariably says whether the person speaking is of higher rank than the person they're speaking to or of lower rank than the person they're speaking to. And that's always defined by virtue of the way people talk. So Japanese society, you have to do that first when you're meeting a stranger. It doesn't matter if someone's already told you who that person is. You still have to actually see it. You do that with a card, and that then defines your behavior from that moment on. So there's a very complex Japanese ritual of meeting. Now, among other things, it doesn't involve touching hands. Asians don't tend to, in Asian societies, people don't shake hands. They consider that to be absolutely disgusting, especially if they don't know you. They don't know where your hand's been. So in that regard, you're going to have non-touch communication. And you think of the American system, it tends to be at least superficially very casual. Oh, hi, I'm so-and-so, you shake the hand, give your name. Very rarely in the American system, even in a business situation, would you actually have any idea what that person's position is, and say if you're meeting folks from another company. They'll identify with their name, but in most cases, they probably won't tell you what it is they actually do. And the American business card, the big part is the name. The position in the company, like my Chaminade cards, the big thing is my name. The smaller part actually says what I am at Chaminade. That would make no sense in Asia. My Chinese business cards are all the name of the company and what I am, Chaminade University, my name's on the back. Same with the Japanese cards. No one cares who you are. They just want to know what you are. So these are classic social rituals, and greeting rituals are among the most common. There's whole books on the greeting rituals that you have to know if you're going to deal with X, Y, and Z. And what this does, this puts a lot of constraints on people and a lot of pressure on people. Rituals are very, very complicated. And a good example would be something like Valentine's Day, which is can be a very stressful holiday, or I don't know what you want to call it. It certainly is a ritual in the United States in terms of what individuals have to do and what they're expected to do. And for example, if you don't have a significant other or somebody you're going to do a Valentine's with, even the fact that you can't do the ritual becomes, and for some folks, an emotional, psychological crisis. So rituals are defined by the group, and then individuals have a set of, rules or parameters of guidelines on what you're supposed to do during the ritual. Individuals do not make rituals. An individual can come up with something, but it isn't until the group buys into it that it's actually a ritual. And the main function of rituals is to reinforce the group. In doing a ritual, you're reinforcing the fact that you accept the group and the power of the group and the ability of the group to tell you what to do and how and when to do it. So that's the importance of ritual. Rituals are a major part of social cohesion with groups. And this is why you see, back if you go and ask your parents back in the 80s and 90s, greeting rituals here, as in many parts of the United States, got really complicated. The whole thing where you do the bumped arms, you do this and the other stuff, and for a while, it's just like, dude, you take like 5 minutes saying hello to someone who don't know who they are. Well, that was a really big thing back then. I don't see that much now. I'm not sure if it's still around. Maybe it is. But that would be very specifically defined how you're supposed to greet someone. Rites of passage. Rites of passage are, again, one of these things that are fairly consistent. Almost all societies have rites of passage. Some societies had rites of passage and they've disappeared. So for example, in American society, in Anglo-American society, there used to be rites of passage for adulthood. By the late 20th century, those largely vanished and now they're gone. And you can see this classic confusion, those of you that just graduated from high school fairly recently. If you think about it, if you're a senior in high school and you will say you're graduating and you're 18 years old, well, you think, okay, now I'm an adult. You know, I can go into the military, I can be shot, I can do all sorts of stuff. But if you actually find out, you find that for many states, for example, you can't drink, I think it's in Oregon, you can't drink till you're 21. So even though you're an adult, you can't consume alcoholic beverages legally. Yeah, it was 21 in Oregon. You can't do certain things, you know, that you have to be 21 to do. But even that doesn't really play out because you find if you try to get a car and you have car insurance, your car insurance defines you as an adult when you're 25 or 26. So, you know, at that situation, when you graduate from high school, there's that long ceremony people are talking to, you know, they're doing all virtually or whatever, and this whole long thing goes on forever. You're dressed in that silly ass outfit and the whole 9 yards. You think, okay, and the big deal is, okay, now you guys are adults, you're leaving school. So, you know, in the United States, that isn't adulthood anymore. Adulthood is something that's going to happen for most folks in most ways when they become 21, which would be, you know, during or after graduate from university. So adulthood is a rite of passage that's disappeared in mainstream American society. Some of the subgroups in American society still have adulthood ceremonies. In Japanese society, you still have a social ceremony, a bureaucratic ceremony when you're 21/22, depending on what day you're born, that's done actually in front of city halls. And that's when you get your adult, you know, sort of ID card, citizen card. And that's when you're considered an adult. But in Japanese society, that's still a formal ritual, that whole rites of passage thing. So that's still a very formal system that everyone knows you're either of adulthood or you're not. In American society, you know, it swings between 18 to 25 years of age, depending on what you're talking about and what context. So, you know, someone who's 19, say, started at Chaminade last year, they say, I'm an adult. Yeah, well, maybe, sort of. But not according to the way the Americans at a variable way think of this concept. So that's a rite of passage that collapsed. I've never looked into why it's collapsed, why it disappeared. It used to be that when most people just graduated from high school, when you graduated from high school and the idea of 18, you were an adult. And you still see this, for example, in the military. You can go into the military when you become an adult at age 18. So that's part of an older system. The thing that's really interesting about rites of passage, in a lot of societies, these are very, very serious, very formal, and very structured, is that they invariably have to have three parts of it. Because a rite of passage has to be important. If it isn't important and people don't give a squat about it, and it's not a rite of passage, it's just sort of maybe a, you know, wasting time ritual. And the key parts are this. And again, this is where high school graduation is really fascinating, because high school graduation still goes through the rites of passage. But I'm pretty sure that most folks in high school don't actually maybe buy into it the way that it originally was intended when high school graduation started a century ago, when it still was a rite of passage formally. So in a rite of passage, you just have to start out with the old. So a rite of passage invariably talks about the past. So if you think about high school graduation, this would be the whole senior year, you know, people getting together, you know, I don't know if they have like year, I can't remember what high school was. High school was not that interesting to me. But whatever people do during the last couple of weeks in their senior year. And of course, high school is a huge thing here. So there's all this stuff, you know, clubs getting together, people doing stuff, getting together and doing the last bit of being part and being a senior in high school. That's the old system. And so when we actually get to the graduation part of that, we'll be talking, the first part we'll talk about what you guys went through, what you guys experienced, the ways that were, okay, what you used to be or what you were. Now, what you then get to is then you're going to have some person probably talking for way too long about what you're going to turn into. What's actually happened is you're now what we call the liminal state. And for anthropologists, this is the one that's really interesting, because a liminal state means that you're moving from what you were, a kid or teenager, into something new. In this case, we'll say an adult. And you just don't, you want to have that period in between where you're not the one or the other. This generates emotional, social, cognitive stress, and that's the intent. Rites of passage only work if people are emotionally invested in them. And you do that through this liminality. Best example of this I ever know, because it's been around for a couple of thousand years, would be going to the military. You're a civilian, you go into the military, they strap you down, they shave your head, they take away all your clothes, they give you a bunch of new clothes, which are generally not fitting very well. And in that situation, you're now in boot camp. And boot camps have been around for over 2,000 years in different societies, but they're all the same. So what you have is for a period of time, maybe 8 to 12 to 15 weeks, whatever it is, I forget. You have this period where you're not in the military yet, but you're not a civilian anymore. Your civilian life has been left behind. For a short period of time, you're not allowed to communicate with anyone outside of the base. So you basically have vanished to the outside world. And for the outside world, and for you, the outside world has vanished. You're at a particular barracks, you're doing a particular thing with a group of people, and that's it. You're not allowed any outside interference. So in that period of time, you're not fish nor fowl. You're not a civilian, but you're not accepted as a member of the military yet. You're in an intermediate stage, and that's the liminal stage. Now, militaries, and we know this from the Roman Empire, the Romans used to do this really well too. In fact, modern boot camps are basically just a Roman boot camp without swords. Is what you do is you have guys in charge, and these would be DIs or drill instructors, whose job is to stress you out as much as possible to get you to forget the old, and also make it very clear to you you're never going to fit into the new. You're not good enough. And so they put as much emotional, cognitive, social stress as possible in that liminal state. And the reason they do that is they want to make sure that the transition from civilian to being a member of the military is effective. And the way to do that is to make it a major jump. And you do that by putting as much emotional energy as you can into that liminal in-between state. And so at the end of it, you graduate and you get out of boot camp, and now you're in the military. And it's not by accident that folks in the military will almost invariably be able to tell you, in many cases, even 20, 40 years later, who their drill instructor was. And they can tell you things that happened during boot camp for the very simple reason that emotionally, in many cases, it might have been as important, if not more important, than some of the law stuff they went through while they're actually in the military. Because in that process, they're no longer civilians. They're now part of a new thing. And you do that through that liminality. And you see this when it coming of age ceremonies. I mean, all sorts of different societies, different rites of passage do different things. But one is they're all shared. And two is they all put an enormous amount of very sophisticated emphasis on this liminal state to stress you out in terms of making it important that you're not this anymore. And if you think about it, this is where high school graduations fail. There's very little emotion attached to the idea that, say the principal, whoever's head the school walks in, we'll say it's like Iolani, since people pay a lot of money to go there. And the principal comes up in front and says, okay, you guys are not graduating, you're not seniors anymore, you're now graduating. By the way, we were just looking over the records. We think a lot about 70% of you did a really crappy job, so we're not going to graduate you. But I'm not going to tell you who that is yet. And then it goes on for the next 20 minutes to talk about what you guys did lame and what you guys did wrong. And That's going to generate a huge amount of emotional stress, because all of a sudden you're thinking, oh shit, I'm not going to get through this. I might not make it. Did I do good enough? Now, what that also means is all of a sudden at the end when he says, okay, we're going to graduate you all. Now it's going to be a huge sigh of relief, because now you're something new. Now you feel like you went through the hoops. Now you feel like you went through some sort of stressful situation and you become something new. So rites of passage are really interesting from an anthropological standpoint, because they're hugely important to societies in terms of defining what you are. People can self-tell you what they think they are, but that's not, to be honest, in most cases, isn't worth the trouble listening to. What you want to know is what the group thinks they are. And that's done in many cases through rites of passage. Life stages is related to that. Age grades and age stages are somewhat similar. Life stages would be the different periods that you go through in a society where people treat you differently. You see this in sociology with the discussion of role theory, where we actually take on new roles as we go through life. If you think about it, there was the roles you had when you were kids, what you could act like, how you were supposed to do, what your responsibilities were. As you became a teenager, those morphed. And of course, now that you're adults, they've morphed yet again. If you suddenly act like you were 10 and you tried to behave in the way that 10-year-olds behave, people would think you'd sort of lost it, because you've moved beyond that life stage. You've segued into a new one. Now, some people are dragged kicking and screaming. I remember some friends saying that when they're high school, one of the ladies that graduated, they were in their 50s. And she still, basically, that's, I guess, the last time that anything important happened to her is when she was a high school cheerleader. So she sort of acted like a 50-year-old high school cheerleader. And they kept on pointing out it was pretty weird, because that didn't make any sense when you're 50 years old. You're not 16 anymore. Not only are you not physically 16, but behaviorally, being a 50-year-old adult in American society has vastly different expectations in terms of behavior, the way you speak, all sorts of stuff. that was not true when you were 16. If you were 16 trying to act like 50, you'd be just as weird as being 50 trying to act like you're 16. All societies have life stages in them. From one group to the other, however, where those stages are and how many there are is radically different. Probably the biggest striking aspect of American society, I think I mentioned right at the beginning of the semester, American society is actually one of the strangest, is the idea of a teenager. Very powerful, hugely powerful concept in American society that for most groups, they have no idea what a hell a teenager is. They have no idea what it means. And in fact, if they pin you down and ask someone, if you're 19 years old, are you a teenager? You know, on one hand, technically you are a teenager. But on the other hand, most 19-year-olds, and that's including most Chaminade students, would say, no, I'm an adult. You know, but teenagers are a very particular phenomena. And so that's a very American life stage, whereby you move from child to teenager to an adult. Most societies would have non-adults, i.e. children, and then adults. They don't have this weird intermediate stage. And you'd have to go back and maybe Mitch or someone could answer when that started up. I have no idea when teenagers showed up, but I can guarantee it's no earlier in the 20th century. In the 19th century in the United States, all you had was kids. Then you had adults. So I suspect teenager probably started in the 1930s, 1940s, something like that. But I don't know. You have to go to check it out. So that's life stages. So that sort of gets through this because rituals are heavily involved in communications because rituals and rites of passage are almost invariably staged in some way, shape, or form. They've got a lot of ceremonies or other things attached to them. There's almost invariably people speaking or doing stuff. So there's a huge amount of very complex forms of communication, symbolic messaging, etc., that goes on in rituals and life rites of passage. And in fact, if you think when you go through life stages, you change the words that you use, the way that you speak, etc. So likewise, again, communication language is intimately tied to life stages. And this is one of the complications you get when you go to another society. If you don't know about the life stages, for example, you're not going to be sure why one person talks to you maybe differently than another person talks to you, because you don't understand in your society, maybe those ages aren't unique. There's nothing different about them. But in that group, they very well might be. So for example, folks from say China studying Americans would have a really hard time figuring out what the hell a teenager was. You know, they might know conceptually in some way, shape, or form, but figuring out who's a teenager and what that means. Oh, I wish them a lot of luck because I'm not even sure what teenager means. So that gets us through rituals. So communications and rituals sort of finishes off this whole sort of package.